So, what triggers panic attacks? You might be curious about what triggers them in general, but more likely you're curious about what triggers them specifically for you or a loved one. There are definitely scientific and biological explanations for panic attacks. And actually, about 1 in 3 adults will get a panic attack at some point in their lifetime, which is a really high number. Still, most people want to know, why me? Why did I develop panic attacks? And that why is useful to know if it can help us prevent them and recover from them, really heal from them. And often people want to know what triggers their panic attacks because they want to avoid that so they don't have the panic attack in the future, which does make a lot of logical sense, but is actually harmful in the long run. And I do talk a little bit more of the impact that avoidance has in terms of actually increasing your anxiety and increasing your likelihood to have panic attacks in a video I did a couple of weeks ago. So I'll link that here. But avoidance isn't the answer. So I'm going to talk through what causes panic attacks in general, and then the most common triggers for people. They generally fall into two categories. And I'll be using examples that really I learned and I gathered this information through working with people over the course of 20 years as a psychotherapist who specialized in anxiety. So, if you've ever had a panic attack and gone to the hospital or a doctor because you thought you were having a heart attack or some kind of major physical problem, and you've been told it's all in your head, that is really not true at all, because panic attacks are very physical. They are physiologically based. The body, your physical body, is responding to something that it is viewing as a life threatening threat. This threat may or may not be conscious, really. So sometimes triggers are subconscious, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. But really, your body is having an overblown response to something that seems threatening, and it's a physical response. And this is the physical response that you would need if you were running away from a saber-toothed tiger. It is generally not the physical response you need when it is a something you're thinking about, or most of the problems that we are facing today are not ones we have to flee from. And those chemicals that your body is producing to deal with this threat are very useful if you actually have to run away or fight, but they are not useful for most of the problems we have today. And they just build up in your system more and more to the point that you end up in a panic. So it really is a physical phenomena. And really, the separation between mind and body, like even saying mind body, right? There's really no difference. Our mind is in our body. And yes, every time we have a thought, we produce chemicals. Every time we have a thought, our body changes. Every time we do something physically, there's an impact on our brain. We're all interconnected. So, on an individual level, I do think it's helpful to know what triggers or has triggered your panic attacks, because I think it can help you know what tools to pull out and when to pull them out. It can help you know what needs to be healed. And possibly most importantly, it can help you use your frontal lobe, the front part of your brain, your conscious, directed thoughts, to help the rest of your brain differentiate between what is actually happening now, which doesn't require the panic response, and what happened either in the past, which is embedded in your old brain, or what you are anticipating happening in the future. So, really being able to utilize that part of your brain that can be like, okay, that's past, that's future, this is present, because your emotional brain, the older parts of your brain, don't differentiate with time. So sometimes knowing the triggers can really help you do that. Okay, so in my experience as a therapist, helping people recover from panic attacks, and I do want to say you really truly can fully get over panic attacks. But in my experience, most of the triggers fell into one of two categories. I'm going to call the first category conscious triggers and the second subconscious. So a conscious trigger would be an event, like you remember a very specific event that caused a huge amount of anxiety. And perhaps it was that event where you actually ended up in your first panic attack, or it was that event that made you have a lot of anxiety. And then the next time you encountered that event or that situation, you went into a panic attack. So you can really tie it to something very specific. So I call that a conscious trigger. Now, that kind of situation often leads to a phobia, a fear and avoidance of that event or situation. And as I said, over time, that is going to make the fear and phobia worse and worse. Eventually, a fear of the fear develops. A fear of having the panic attack is the main fear you're facing, and you anticipate it earlier and earlier, which is more and more guaranteeing that you will end up having a panic attack. And then this fear of fear can broaden beyond the specific event, beyond the specific phobia, and really become full-blown panic disorder. So the other category is what I would call the subconscious triggers. This is where somebody ends up in a panic attack that they don't tie to a particular thought or a particular event. People will say, no, that panic attack hit me out of the blue. It came out of nowhere. I wasn't even particularly anxious about anything. I have no idea why, and I thought I was having a heart attack, and they won't have any sense of why that hit them or where it came from. And this can feel like an actual attack from your own body. It feels like your own body is attacking you. It's really horrible and scary. So working with people who had this type of panic attack out of the blue or a subconscious trigger, and I will come back to what I mean by that, but working with them was a little bit different because you really had to begin to help the person not be afraid of the physical feelings that their body was having. And it was almost more like processing the trauma of the first panic attack that would help. And then eventually you might be able to go back into history and find some type of root. Usually, with time, you could identify it, but first you really would be working simply with that fear of fear. So if that's the type of panic that you have, really increasing your tolerance to those physical feelings is required. Very difficult, but that's what will eventually help, is not to worry as much about those physical feelings. Not saying that's easy. So in the video I put out, I think last week, I talked about two situations. One was Robert, whose trigger was very conscious, and the other was Susie, whose trigger was subconscious. And I'll just briefly mention the stories here. You might want to go back and watch that video if you haven't yet seen it. But Robert's sort of trigger event was being in the ninth grade, playing a game of basketball in front of a crowd, like he was on the team, and there was a whole audience watching the competition, and he ran to the wrong basket and made the basket. Felt humiliated, totally ashamed, avoided basketball, and then began avoiding any type of situation where he was in front of an audience. So that became a real phobia of having the spotlight on him in any way, which, as you know, can really be limiting in life as you become an adult or you have a job or you have to give a speech or a talk, even at school, right? So we had a very obvious conscious event that happened that caused an anxiety that then led to the fear of being in those situations, which led him to avoid them whenever possible. And then when not possible, they'd be anticipated months before happening. If he knew he had to give a talk at school or then later at the job, months and months before that would happen, his anxiety would start going up. In the other case, Susie had a panic attack hit her totally out of the blue when she was in the grocery store. She just all of a sudden her heart started racing, pounding, sweating. She felt faint. She thought she was going to pass out. She definitely thought she was having at least a stroke. So that was totally subconscious. She would say she had no idea where it came from or why it happened at that moment. Both eventually can develop into panic disorder. So I encourage you to do the detective work to figure out what the core experience was. And if your triggers are totally subconscious, right, the current day work is the same. The current day work is learning the tools. I do talk about this in my video, CBT video on panic disorder, but learning the tools to physiologically calm yourself, learning to distance from your thoughts and change how you're interpreting what's happening to you, right? So you still have to do that. But going deeper to the core events can really help you begin to say, okay, I was in danger then, but I'm not in danger now. And people don't always relate to this term danger, right? But if you are having a panic attack, there is an underlying belief that you are in danger. It might be danger from social rejection, right? So, the example of the kid with the basketball game, his major fear was embarrassment and being rejected by the social group, which fundamentally is a form of danger on kind of a very innate old brain level, right? But there is a feeling of I'm in danger if I'm humiliated. I'm in danger if I'm excluded from the group. Now, obviously, other examples that then develop into panic attacks could be real physical danger. So, helping the brain say, yes, I was in danger then, but I am not in danger now. Super important. And then also looking into this underlying feeling of not being safe. How early did that develop, right? And that is useful to do mainly for self compassion, which is super important for healing, and understanding that for children, not having the emotional caretaking that you need as a child. You're dependent on other people. You are vulnerable. You are vulnerable, but you're also vulnerable in a way that you'll never be vulnerable again as an adult. You'll never be that vulnerable. So, again, it's really helping yourself develop the self compassion, seeing where this developed, and then reassuring yourself with your frontal lobe I'm safe enough now. So, do check out my video on CBT for panic disorder, and then also the one I'll be doing next week about using EMDR to heal from panic disorder. Let me know if you found this helpful. Let me know if you have questions, and please hit that like button if you found this video useful and subscribe to my channel. And I will see you next week.